In practice, what I was seeing was either we were really not making any change at all, which was often the case, or the changes we were making were so marginalized off to the side and not part of the business model itself. In fact, it was sort of an apology for the business model. Our business model kicked you in the face. We'll patch up your bruises over here.
You're listening to The Uncertainty Edge, the show about the art and science of moving forward when the path isn't clear. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan. Each episode, I sit down with leaders, advisors, and thinkers to explore how they navigate uncertainty, make better decisions, and stay focused in a world that rarely cooperates. Together, we'll look for the clarity hidden inside uncertainty. Welcome to The Uncertainty Edge. I'm your host, Sam Sivarajan. Today, I'm joined by Lorraine Smith, a sustainability strategist and author who has spent over 20 years working with global companies on the role of financial capital on sustainability and ESG. And she's come to a provocative realization. Our efforts to improve the system often end up reinforcing it. Her work focuses on helping experienced sustainability and impact professionals who spent years trying to make business a force for good, but now see that it's not about sustaining what's breaking. It's about learning to serve life again. Through her practice change method and bespoke advisory work, Lorraine helps change makers cultivate clarity, courage, and discernment so they can meet complexity and uncertainty with steadiness and turn overwhelming situations into real change. She's the voice behind On the Path to Industrial Healing, a weekly newsletter that shares field notes and provocations from the edges of business, systems change, and what she calls the emergent life-affirming paradigm. For executives seeking to lead with integrity in uncertain times, or financial advisors navigating client conversations about ESG, Lorraine offers both critical analysis and practical pathways forward, focusing on what works rather than getting stuck in what doesn't. Lorraine, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here.
My pleasure. Lorraine, as I said in the intro, you've spent almost 2 decades working with global companies on the role of financial capital in issues of sustainability, ESG, and so forth. And you've said that we've made impact measurable, but not meaningful, and the conditions for life keep deteriorating. Can you talk a little bit about that? What led you to that conclusion, and what does it reveal about how we're approaching corporate responsibility and sustainability?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Sam. It's a big one. In a funny way, I feel like it just took me a really long time to understand the obvious. And then I realized, oh, maybe it actually isn't that obvious, because the way our systems are designed, it makes a lot of normal things, it makes a lot of things that are harmful feel normal, and a lot of more life-affirming things feel edgy or radical. So I'll just build a little bridge between where I began and where I find myself now. At the beginning of this century, so actually starting in 1999, and for the first few years till 2003, I actually worked in financial services. It's how our common friend, Laura Jeffrey, and I come to know one another. And by the way, I'm a huge fan of her pioneering work and loved your show that you had with her. And there I was in mainstream finance before we talked about sustainability. The acronym ESG wasn't really on the radar. And I remember asking my colleagues how they felt. We were in the 401k industry, so group pensions and employer-sponsored savings for retirement. And the main buttons we were pushing to increase the assets under management for the firm were to show that time is on your side, invest often, invest early. And I asked this really innocent question one day, what if we showed investors what their money was doing over the decades that it was invested?
Beyond the return on capital, you mean, in terms of
Exactly. Where is the money? Because if I'm 24, for example, and I'm putting $50 aside every month or 30 or whatever it is for decades so that I can retire wealthy, what's the money doing? Well, it's not in my hands. And Sam, it was a mix of sort of gentle ridicule and firm ostracization. It was an absurd question to ask. And I was gently pulled aside by my VP after that particular meeting to say, Lorraine, nobody cares what the money's doing, as long as there's a lot more of it when they retire. That's what prompted me to leave mainstream business And in 2003, I entered the field of what we then called corporate social responsibility, CSR. I lived in Toronto at the time. And I very naively thought this will give you the sense of the naivete. I asked my boss at the firm that I joined, it was a boutique corporate consultancy that helped companies with their corporate social responsibility. And I asked my new boss on day one, so when will we be closing the firm? And she says, why would we close the firm? And I said, because we finished. We got the work done. And she's like, oh, no, this work will never be done. And I should have twigged then, oh, wait a minute. You mean we're a self-perpetuating industry? We just create more work for ourselves. It's not what she meant, I don't think. But fast forward till 2021, so almost 20 years after that naive question, beginning in a boutique consultancy. I worked there for 4 years. I ended up on management. I left to freelance. I moved from Toronto to New York City. I got hired by an even more prestigious boutique consultancy called Sustainability, if you can believe it, and was doing more and more work with Fortune 500 companies, corporate strategy. Now we are calling it ESG. We're focusing on investors. And I kept asking, when will the changes be made? Because in theory, what we're trying to do is work with companies to make change. But in practice, what I was seeing was either we were really not making any change at all, which was often the case, or the changes we were making were so marginalized off to the side and not part of the business model itself. In fact, it was sort of an apology for the business model. Sorry, our business model kicked you in the face. We'll patch up your bruises over here, to be crass. And so in 2021, I realized after doing that mainstream work for quite some time, this wasn't changing. This is the business model of mainstream sustainability and ESG, is to keep generating data and stories about either the patches or the harm reduction tactics. And for me, that felt not only not enough, it felt directionally not
Opposite.
viable. So I stepped away in 2021 to go in a different direction. But that's the long story is, it took me 20 years to see that even corporate sustainability work supposedly dedicated to making real change, it really just was not making those real on the ground changes for the people and places where it really matters.
I think that resonates with a lot of the listeners in terms of the evolution that we've seen about ESG, impact investing, what have you. Before we move to what you're doing now and where your focus is, I do want to explore this a little bit to provide context to our listeners. And when we spoke earlier, one of the things that you said absolutely tweaked my interest is what you call Weasel speak. Again, most listeners can relate to this, I think. What you're talking about is corporate language that sounds substantive while really saying nothing. So phrases like addressing issues related to corporate governance, compliance, and stakeholder relations could mean virtually anything. So when financial advisors or investors are reviewing these kinds of disclosures, how should they be cutting through this vague language to understand what really is happening behind these scenes?
Yeah, Sam, I love that question. And I feel a bit embarrassed answering it. So let me just come clean on something up front. I sped through a couple decades of mainstream corporate sustainability and ESG work, but what I skipped over was a big part of my income was from corporate reporting. So I helped write, and sometimes I was the lead
Weasel?
advisor. Yeah, on generating weasel words. I That's how I come to know the term, is I have been a speaking weasel or a writing weasel. And hopefully not. I mean, hopefully even then I was pushing for something that actually meant something.
Right.
But in all sincerity, especially in the years 2016 through 2021, I mentioned I moved to New York City. I worked for sustainability. And for 4 years, I worked as the lead of the director, the New York based office. I was the director of that firm. And things were troubling me. I could go deeper if that is useful. But I left in January 2016. In fact, I'm about to have my 10-year anniversary of being totally independent. So I haven't had a paycheck from an employer since January 2016. And I thought at the time, well, I'll go out on my own so that I can do more courageous work. I can, speak truth to power, as they say. I can take my expertise and deploy it in ways that are more aligned with what I think we need to do. And what that turned into was I got really busy doing ESG reporting. And to be honest, I think because initially I thought, well, I'm not sure how this is going to go. I should see who's out there, what's the appetite for a hired gun. Well, the appetite in 2016 for a hired gun with experience in corporate sustainability was in reporting, because the cottage industry of ESG reporting was just mushrooming. And so I was the lead advisor of several, I won't throw them under the bus publicly, but household names in Fortune 500 publicly listed companies, helping them organize their disclosures. You could say for a range of stakeholder audiences, but the honest truth is the majority of this at this time was being pulled together for investors, because this is when the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, was just coming to the fore. Of course, our newly anointed Prime Minister, Mark Carney, was one of the lead architects of that. So there was a lot of appetite for deeper data and story, to a degree, on what companies were doing in the what was sometimes called non-financial realm. So environmental, social, and governance impacts and other activities. And so we churned out like thousands, I think probably tens of thousands of pages of reports. And so I just come clean there to say, like, I've been part of this. I've been a stakeholder in reporting frameworks. I've been the typer of the words. I've been the architect of reports. I've been an advisor. I've been interviewed as a stakeholder. I've seen it from a number of angles. And I will still say, it is my humble and not very happy opinion that you can check all the disclosure boxes. You can be 100% compliance. You can even win awards in transparency and say not a whole heck of a lot. So to answer your very important question, then how can advisors find what's going on, right? I'd say there's really one question they can ask, which is, can I see what's changed? If I read this information, can I see what's changed? And I would add a little phrase on the end, if possible, which is on the ground. So the answer to what's changed might be something like, they published more pages on the topic. It's like, okay. And literally that is often cited as, we're doing much better this year. We published an extra 10 pages on human rights. And it's like, no, we're talking about humans and their rights, not word count. Maybe there's something good in there, but often the bizarre things that if you pulled at what's changed on the ground, if you could see it, you'd see that they disclosed around more laws. Well, there were more laws because there was more egregious behavior that needed to be somehow corralled. So now we have more laws we're talking about, but that if you talk about the human beings and what's happened, or the ecosystems or the waterways. So the one thing I would guide advisors to look for is what's changed. And unfortunately, I think often they'll end up saying, we can't tell. And then I'd say, well, if you're on an earnings call, and by the way, if you scan what investors ask, and I'm a bit of a investor earnings call junkie. I love to listen in and read the transcripts of publicly listed companies and watch what investors are asking. Often they're asking for stuff that isn't disclosed in the financial reports. They want to read between the lines. They want to hear more from executives. You're at 100% liberty to ask those questions. You're also at 100% liberty to ask those questions about ESG factors. And so I think it's about asking what's changing on the ground here.
I think that's very powerful. And by the way, this is not just with ESG, on anything in corporate initiatives or whatever. It's the and so what question, right? I mean, and so what? It's a great initiative. It's a great approach. All of these things sound great on paper, but so what? What does this actually mean? I mean, we should all be looking for things that have meaningful results as a consequence of the actions that we're taking, right? And it doesn't have to be right away. But if we're not saying that this action, this initiative, this report is directed towards X, Y, Z as a result in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, it begs the question, why are we doing it?
Yeah. May I add another thing I guide advisors and others looking closely to look for if they have the curiosity? So one of the things as a creator of those reports that I'd like to kind of point to, I'm just going to pull the curtain for a moment and say, you may not have noticed, if you look at financial reports, so the annual report, for example, or other sort of mainstream things that go into the proxy, like the stuff that investors would typically look at. And then if you hop over to probably another section of the website, although some companies are getting better and better at putting all the downloads in one place. But if you go to the ESG report or the sustainability report and you search for content on the same topic, look for consistency. And there's a couple things that I would say to watch for. First of all, watch for cut and paste. The number of times I saw us literally cut and paste from the same place, it's like, but wait, is that?
We said this before.
Yeah, we said this before. Is this still true? Does it? And it literally was just like boilerplate copy. It might not be incorrect, but it's not very informative. So that is Weasel speak to me, where it's just a cut and paste. But even more informative is when you see one thing in the annual report and then you see another thing on the same topic in the sustainability report. And even better, if you've got time to go into, especially if they're a publicly listed company, for example, operating in the United States, they are required to disclose their lobbying expenses. Anything over $5,000, I think, is required to be disclosed. And so if you start to triangulate, and I've done a bit of that looking at how, for example, a mining company in their financial report, just lists fines. And then in their sustainability report, they talk about ethics. But then you go into other disclosures, including in the lobbying area, and you're like, wow, they, like Glencore, for example, I think in their 2022 disclosures, they spent $1.1 billion on one fine for corruption. $1.1 billion. That's a big fine. Oh, that's way more than a lot of companies earn in revenue. That was one fine in 1 year. So once you start to triangulate different documents that have different either compliance expectations or different audiences on the same topic, you can start to form a real picture. And then just ask deeper questions, or determine, does that matter to you? Is that important for you as you're thinking about this in your portfolio?
That's a very interesting point. And I take it that your conclusion from this is that there is no coordination or connection between the way these items are treated in separate reports. So you could talk about a fine being paid or lobbying efforts being taken in, for example, in the annual report. And then you talk about all the sustainability efforts. And I take it that your point means, well, if you're doing all the great work on sustainability, why are you paying a fine over here? Or why are you having to spend money on lobbying? It would seem that you've got people beating a path to your door because you're doing all this great work over here on sustainability. Is that a fair conclusion for one to draw?
Yeah, I think so, Sam. I mean, my general rule of thumb from what I've seen, and I know a number of lobbyists in different sectors, you don't need to lobby to do the right thing. And now, to be fair, there is lobbying activity that pushes for better regulation or more comprehensive regulation that would serve a range of stakeholders. Sometimes lobbying is really pushing for improvements that the environment and humans would benefit from. But most lobbying, for example, to be allowed to act in areas of
It's an
sensitive
exemption,
habitat,
right, from rules,
yeah,
like why the
they're
rules
looking
shouldn't apply
for,
to you.
that's right. They're looking for permission to go ahead. So a super concrete example would be another mining company. They're easy to pick on, and we can say more about the good stuff going on there in a moment. But Barrick Gold, Canadian company headquartered in Toronto, where we both have connections. I wasn't even looking for this. I wasn't trying to throw them under the bus. I was actually trying to understand something I saw in a lobbying disclosure that referenced the sage grouse. And the sage grouse, if you haven't met a sage grouse, I encourage you to just take a moment and Google. They are the most beautiful birds. They're extraordinary. They're truly wonderful. And they nest in the ground and they have habitat that happens to overlap with some of where Barrick Gold would like to be doing some mining. And so the obvious story there is Barrick is lobbying to have greater permission to rip up the Earth's crust in sage grouse territory. And so I happened to bump into that in the lobbying disclosures. I was looking for something else. I came upon it, and it looks like a lot of activity around the sage grouse to the tune of close to $1 million in lobbying on sage grouse and other matters in 1 year. That's a fair bit of money to spend, talking about sage grouse.
Mm.
So I looked in their sustainability report to see what's up with the sage grouse. Sam, if you were to look in Barrick's ESG or sustainability, I forget how they call their report that year, you'd swear the purpose of the company is to protect sage grouse. Like you'd think all these guys do is protect the habitat of sage grouse. But if you look in the lobbying and then you look in the local headlines of the newspapers in this area, you see, oh, no. They're getting more permission to dig more holes in the ground where sage grouse live. And so it's not looking good for the sage grouse. So you have to do a lot of triangulating to understand, why are they spending this money? And be honest about it. It's so they can mine more, and it's going to cause some harm to at least a few species and maybe whole ecosystems. And that's the reality of why they're lobbying.
Now, if we switch gears a bit, Lorraine, you said that you're less inclined to throw companies under the bus and want to more focus on noticing patterns in a way that it's kind of all of us in a lot of ways. We're all part of the problem, and we're also part of the solution. So can you unpack that? How are we as consumers, investors, and general participants in the economy complicit in perpetuating these kind of systems that, as you call it, don't serve life, even when we think we're making responsible choices?
Yeah, this is a big one, Sam. There's a lot of threads to pull on here. I mean, maybe I'll start again by just coming clean and try to. It's again our friend Lauren Jeffrey who likes to talk about. I'll keep my side of the street as clean as I can. I am the granddaughter of a mining company executive. So my grandfather was a metallurgist and then had a senior role at what is now Vale, which was Inco, International Nickel Company. And fast forward to my professional career, and I've done work with Vale, which is now a Brazilian company. I'm a Brazilian Portuguese speaker, so I've had the good fortune of doing some work in Brazil. And so I personally consider myself both of the mining industry, like I exist and have benefit as a white settler in Canada as the descendant of a senior mining professional. I live in Northern Ontario, which has economically benefited in many ways from mining. And as a professional, I've worked for mining companies. Also, of course, we're talking on our devices here. I'm using a laptop, which is made largely of mined minerals. So it's not lost on me that every single day that I have existed, I've in many ways been dependent upon and existing because of
As
mining.
most of us are, as you point
Exactly.
out.
Exactly. So I want to make it super clear. I don't really feel an us and them in this situation. I feel like this is all of us all the time, everywhere, always has been, always will be.
Hmm.
And then the other distinction I like to look at as much as I can, although these are very interconnected, dynamic living systems, but a fun division that's fairly easy for most of us to point to is to look at financial flows in relation to what we earn and what we spend. And so I mostly look at earning, as in what I do as a professional and what I guide others. I work privately with coaching clients, I facilitate a community, and I often also do team work. So with companies who bring me on board as an advisor. So I am largely looking at how professional individuals and organizations generate value or earn income. So most of my perspective lives on the earn side. But of course, there's also a spend side. I eat, I pay my bills, I live, I have friends and talk about consumerism and whatever. So I don't ignore the consume or spend side, but most of my focus is on business models and how they can generate value in ways that enable life to thrive. So I just wanted to set that stage before I jump in. Does that distinction make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And so with that, that all sounds so simple. So now let me complexify. And I love that your work focuses on uncertainty because this is where I think what you're doing is a kind of alchemy and it's very important. I'm sure you've bumped into folks who kind of just want the answer, right? Like, well, what are we supposed to do? Or, where's the roadmap? But I think where we are, we've probably been here before. This maybe isn't that special a time, but where we are right now for sure is at a time when there are pretty undeniable ecological and societal pressures on, I'm going to say most of us. I'm sure some people, blissfully carrying on and not concerned, but many people in many parts of the world are experiencing everything from, abject poverty and like severely unmet needs
Hmm.
to ecological instability, whether it's extreme heat, drought, flood, name the difficulties, to social pressures that create mental health
Hmm.
epidemics, obesity epidemic, you name the poly crisis, it's got a whole bunch of arms and legs. So if we are in business and we want to ensure that we're generating value in ways that, first of all, don't cause that. That's a good place to start. And then, second of all, help ameliorate that and help create healing, create systems where humans can be healthy, where societies can thrive and be resilient, where our ecosystems are restoring and rebounding. What does that look like? And the number one thing I want to emphasize for anybody thinking about, like, yeah, I guess that sounds like a good idea, where do we start? Is we probably don't start by taking an existing business and just modifying it for an ecologically and societally thriving way. Like it's not a tweak. It's not
Mhm.
a bit of a business model adaptation. For most industries and most companies within industries, if there's a genuine interest at the sort of purpose level to serve life, it's most likely a bit of a decommissioning and a recommissioning, which is pretty significant. Like it is a major disturbance in most industries. I'm just going to take a breath there and see if that prompts any questions.
No, look, what you say makes sense. Again, there are no sacred cows here. I think what people forget, whether we're talking about companies, industries, or even government systems, none of them are over 200 years old. We've been on the planet for tens of thousands of years. Capitalism in its current form is a 200, 250-year-old system. Everything evolves. We're not talking about revolution, we're talking about evolution here. And the one point maybe I will make, just to kind of paint a picture, and you can tell me whether you agree with it or not. I think this concept of sustainability for many is considered to be radical and considered to be an antithesis, if you will, to capitalism. And I would like to point out to people that one of the poster childs for capitalism was Henry Ford when he invented the automobile. A lot of people focus on the automobile or the assembly line as Henry Ford's greatest contribution to industrialized society. I would argue it's something different. Henry Ford, when he built the Ford Motor Company and built that assembly line, he offered his employees a wage that was double or triple what the going rate was. That is the furthest thing that you can think of from being a capitalist, but it was a very sustainable action that he took because his thinking was he needed consumers to buy his product. And so he wanted his workers to be able to earn enough so that they could eventually become consumers of the product that he was trying to create. To me, that is the definition of sustainability. And it isn't an antithesis to capitalism because for capitalism to survive, you need to have consumers, you need to have workers, you need to have stakeholders that are there. And so the case that you're making, Lorraine, about rethinking, radically redesigning it is, to me, isn't as inflammatory as one might think. I think you're arguing that like the systems that we depend on for work, for the economy, those are good things, but we need to make sure that we are not making short-term profits that aren't sustainable over the longer term, if that's a
Yeah.
fair way of putting it.
Yeah, it is very fair. I super agree. And I might just build by adding a layer or the lens that feels like it's been missing in my view from the debates. Like sustainability is antithetical to capitalism. No, sustainability is part of capitalism. I'm going to like add a third point in the triangle if I can mix
Mhm.
metaphors. Firstly, I want to just say like I don't have a strong leaning of capitalism is good or capitalism is bad. I think like isms can get tossed around and reorganized in lots of ways. But I will say I love the innovation of industry. Like I don't know if you know remember the books Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. I was a huge Roald Dahl fan as a kid, and I think part of what I loved is just good storytelling. But another part was like going into Willy Wonka's factories. Like I just
Mm.
loved poring over that stuff. And I feel so lucky as a professional who, the last 30 years really, I've been going so before I got into financial services, I worked for World Wildlife Fund in it's an environmental NGO, and then I lived in New Zealand and I worked in electronic engineering. I have sort of a checkered past before I got into sustainability. So I was in electronic engineering, I was in graphic design, and then in sustainability. So through these decades of industry, I have had the unbelievable good fortune of being on plantations, so large industrial plantations of different crops from trees to small scale plants. I've been in manufacturing facilities of foods, electronics, clothing, in huge industrial sites and small scale artisanal. I've been in different mine sites. I've flown over, in helicopter over mountaintop removal coal mines. That was an interesting experience. Being at many points of the industrial value chain in many product flows and worked in banking and finance and had a lot of interesting conversations with investors. I've never come out of one of those experiences, maybe with the exception of the mountaintop removal coal. That was actually hard on my soul to see that. But pretty much all of the others, I came out thinking we're just so amazing. We are so full of ideas and innovation and capacity to connect and organize, and it's a beautiful thing. I am in awe of
Hmm.
industry. So I just have to set that straight. Like, I am definitely not that person trying to take down the man. I think the man does some pretty cool stuff. And I think there is a missing lens. I think it is missing for most of us from the second we get dropped into junior kindergarten. And if any of it remains by the time we get to post secondary, it gets like squeaked all the way off of our glasses, unless we go into fine arts or something that's kind of fetishized as interesting thinking and expression, but
Right.
not the way things are. And that is the lens of how life actually works. We are not raised understanding life's principles. We are rewarded for individualistic behavior, and we don't even know what mutualistic behavior is, other than like have good manners and don't punch your friend in the face. We do not get trained in how to think in dynamic living systems. We do not recognize whole or holistic patterns. We recognize symptoms. We see a problem, we try to fix it. That's across the board. And as I mentioned, I've worked in many industries, and this is decades of watching these patterns and trying to develop healthier outcomes. So let's go back into Ford's factory at the beginning of the last century. I applaud the recognition that people should be paid well enough to afford the thing you're making. I think that's a great example. What would be even better if I could go back in time and sprinkle some fairy dust on Ford and Ford's strategic planners is I would also encourage them to pause for a moment and go beyond what is a desirable paycheck for the human beings who work in your factory
Hmm.
and ask, what is a desirable outcome for the wider living systems that keep us alive? And what
100%.
are the waterways? What is the Great Lakes system experiencing as the shorelines industrialize? What does that mean for the migratory birds, for the insect population, for the forested areas? Because that isn't just like for the naturalists who like hiking or the bird watchers who have their lifelong list, how life works. And when we undermine it, over time, we undermine our own ability. And by the way, we're seeing this come home to roost,
Hmm.
because when our ecosystems are degraded, when our mental health is degraded by degraded ecosystems and all the other things, when our gut health is degraded by toxic soils and
Hmm.
waterways and foods, and we are very stressed, we are less creative, we are less able to help ourselves and therefore help others, and that reinforces an individualistic approach. And so being mutualistic, thinking in systems, thinking in community, becomes that much less likely. But while I don't dispute the merit of paying people well, I would have loved to pause and ask, do we really want to make more and more and more and more and more individual automobiles, disincentivize walking, getting around in self-propelled ways? What other ways could we bring these beautiful innovations and talented hard workers and well-paid workers into community to create transportation systems that have a mutual benefit and an economic benefit?
Totally agree with you. I think that my use of Henry Ford's as an analogy wasn't to put him up as a poster child for everything
Mm,
that should be done right. It was to try to illustrate that these aren't mutually antagonistic goals. But I think your perception is absolutely bang on. I think, to me, where I would take this is that, and this will bridge us nicely into the next but I'm not here to kind of say could have, should have, would have, that we could have done
mm,
all of these things better. If we could have, that's great. We made the decisions that we made individually, collectively, as a society. And from the ancient Stoics, we got to focus on what we can control. We can't control those decisions or their impacts in the past. I think, to your point about better understanding today of the complexity and the interconnectedness of different things, and the fact that we have a planet under threat that impacts all of us in the short term, in the medium term, and in the longer term, knowing what we know now, what would we do differently? What is in our control that we could change? And so that's the point that I was trying to make, that you can have goals that are seemingly altruistic, but are actually self reinforcing for a sustainable system that we're talking about. And again, I think the best way I would describe it in pure financial terms is, are you investing in a company that is going to have great next quarter returns? Or would you rather invest in a company that is going to give you a steady stream of really good returns forever and ever in the future? That's the trade-off that I think we should be thinking about making when we're making these kind of sustainability decisions. Is it a one-off, or is it an annuity that we're looking for? Now, if we want to tweak it a little bit, and that's where I wanted to go to, because again, to your point about focusing on, I guess, what works, I want to set the stage a little bit before I ask you the question. So there is a story, a real life story that always captured my imagination. It was one about fighting malnutrition in Vietnam in the early 70s that illustrates what is called a bright spots approach, and I think it's very much in line with what you've talked about of a more of what works and less of what doesn't approach. Just for background for the listeners, there was an American aid worker named Jerry Sternin who was given 6 months to make a measurable difference in Vietnam. A seemingly impossible task, given that malnutrition is a very complex, interconnected, systemic problem. But Sternin, instead of focus on everything that was wrong, he looked for families in the same villages with the same resources whose children were thriving. He discovered that the families where the kids were doing relatively well were adding small crabs and greens from rice paddies to their meals and feeding children smaller portions multiple times a day. He then had these successful local families teach their neighbors. And by doing so, he created real change in 6 months. So he wasn't looking at what was wrong. He was looking at what was right and what was working and trying to replicate that more. So when you look at the role of financial capital, Lorraine, in sustainability, ESG, corporate responsibility today, where are you seeing similar bright spots? People or organizations that are quietly succeeding in ways that we should be studying and replicating at scale?
Yeah. I love this question so much. And I love that example. And I want to pull on something that this example, it's just such a great example of, which is the goal of that initiative, that countering malnutrition, was for people to be healthier. And although it's tricky and it's a tough nut to crack, and I'm sure there was more work to be done, making that the goal is what pulled progress towards that goal. So the number one thing that I see happening in the shift in corporate shift towards an economy that works in service of life is, I'll call it at best an awareness right now. I'm keen for more action on this awareness, an awareness that the goal is not to maximize profits. And we get a lot of lip service to that. We hear a lot about purpose, but I want to just make a super fine point on this. People talk about systems thinking a lot, and you can overthink systems thinking. I'm going to just break it down to the simplest thing because it is pretty simple. A system is made up of three things: separate elements, connections between those elements, and a goal or purpose. So every system has a goal or purpose, whether it's a school. You could say there's living systems and non-living. So there's systems run by human beings, like a school, a church, a company. There's systems that are not run by human beings, but that affect human beings. So, like our kidney, you could say, is a system, right? And each and every system in the whole wide world, no matter how big, small, complex, whatever, are made up of individual elements, connections between those elements, and a goal or a purpose.
So I would say, if I could, individual elements that are working through these connections collectively towards the common purpose. Is that a fair
That's right.
distinction to make?
Yes, although of course it depends on the system, because I'm sure we don't have to look too far to think of a company that in theory has a purpose, but if we talk to some of the individuals there, how much are they working towards that common purpose?
Fair enough.
It depends. But in principle, that's what a system is. But in practice, a system is what a system does. And this is where we need to get real honest about theory versus practice. Many companies, I'd say most big companies, state their purpose, and they have a clear purpose. Sometimes it's even a really wonderful purpose that we might really love. But actually, when you look at what the company does, there's a huge disconnect. So, for example, Google's purpose, and I've done a lot of deep analysis on comparing what companies say their purpose is and what they actually do. I'll borrow Google because they're nice and easy. Everybody knows them. They're a verb. Their purpose is something to the effect of make all the world's data accessible to everyone everywhere. That's actually quite a laudable purpose. I like it and I benefit from it, right? Well, when you look at what Google actually does, and in corporate context, I like to say a parallel way of asking that is, how do they make money?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the way Google makes money is they sell advertising. That's shifting. And as Gemini has come on and more, but essentially they use AI and other computing technology to maximize profit, mostly through the use of user data to sell advertising. That's what Google does. And a byproduct of that is making user data accessible to people kind of almost everywhere. If you look at the founders' statement before they IPO'd in 2004, their purpose was actually very tied to what they still say it is. And if you look at the founders' warnings to investors before they IPO'd about the risk of tying advertising into their business model, you can see that they could see, and lots of people could see, when you mess with the actual purpose of the company, there are real risks. So back to your question, where do I see real like more of what's working and more of what I'd like to see? Where I see folks who are making decisions about how resources are allocated, recognizing that the purpose is not maximize profit. The purpose is to serve, at least serve community and or serve health and wellness or ecosystem restoration. And without that, I'm afraid to say the potential for change is almost zero. I mentioned I'm kind of slow. It took me 20 years of proving that over and over. I've yet to see an exception to that. I'm open to one. I'd love to be proven wrong. But as long as your purpose states one thing, but actually what you're doing is maximizing profit and not energizing that purpose, you're missing out. And if you are really truly energizing that purpose, which you can see because you can see financial impact to that, then that's where real change is starting to happen, when true purpose is driving the boat.
That's a great point. And to echo your sentiment, looking at the literature, for example, I remember the 70s and 80s, the purpose of a company was pure and simple shareholder maximization. And, to talk about any other stakeholder was to be an apostate, right? I mean, it was even though in theory you're serving customers, in theory you've got employees, but none of that mattered. Everything was there as a purpose to shareholder maximization. It's only in the last, call it 10 years or so, that you can actually talk about stakeholder maximization. Now, granted that a lot of that is still lip service and not translating into actual results. The fact that it's come into our vernacular is itself something, but we need to move more on that to say, how is what you do serving your community? How is what you're doing serving your employees? I'll just give one quick example from a personal point of view. So my wife comes from a small town in Austria, and it's about 1,200 people. And there is a family-owned business that is third generation, and it is the largest employer in the region. It's a manufacturing plant. They make high-tech equipment for automobile manufacturers. It employs about 1,500 people, so more than the town. But what always struck me is this is how business was run in the West, in North America, in the 40s and 50s. So the owners of this business, this family-owned business, yes, they have a slightly nicer house. Yes, they drive slightly nicer cars, but they're an active part of that community. So when there's town festivals or whatever, and this is Austria, there's lots of them, they're always there. And so they're part of that community. They're not separate from it. And to me, the juxtaposition of that, which is the way capitalism in theory is supposed to work, to what we're seeing in many cases in the West, where the CEO of a company doesn't live where their employees does. They're not getting paid 10 times or 30 times what their lowest paid employee is. They're getting paid 1,000 times. It's hard to see how you create a community or a sustainable kind of ecosystem. And I don't mean ecosystem from the way that you talk about it, from the environment, although that's important. I'm just talking about a business ecosystem where you can have a sustainable type of enterprise that reinvigorates, re-innovates, recreates, and has that sense of connection and community that I would argue that every for-profit corporation, small or big, argues is what they're really seeking, and yet very few manage to achieve.
Percent. And I think you're touching on a key facet that defines whether or not a company or an organization really succeeds in being more life affirming or part of that life affirming economy. And that is ownership. I mean, it's no secret that one of the biggest challenges with publicly listed companies is that it's absentee ownership. Or even worse, I think I haven't looked at their recent numbers, but a couple years ago, the disclosures for Glencore, global mining company headquartered in Switzerland, their former CEO owned 10% of the company. So it's like, guy doesn't even work there anymore. And he's part of a hundred, multiple hundreds of billions of dollar company that, let's not forget, paid $1.1 billion in fines. So when you are right among the impacts of your decisions, you take care. So one of the places I see the most active shifting and what I would describe as the most promising decisions is in privately held companies and typically in smaller companies. And the easy, I'm going to call it excuse, it's a little bit critical. The easy excuse I hear in the big publicly traded zone is like, yeah, they're smaller, it's easier, they can get away with it, they don't have to disclose as much. That's true, I suppose, but I think the real reason it happens is because they see it, they feel it. Like it's more direct. You're not We know from research over and over the psychology of what we're willing to do in terms of causing harm when we can't see it, when it's remote, when we don't know the people. We are more willing to distance ourselves or just not even know. Whereas when it's right in front of you, you feel a connection. It is a real connection in the true living systems sense of connections.
Percent, and I'm laughing is because as you're talking, I just remember reading like the way Roman engineers had to live with their decisions is once they created a bridge, they were supposed to stand underneath it so that if there was that they got, it's not just you saying, oh yeah, it's safe, it's fine, etc. You have to actually put your money where your mouth is, right? And to your point, maybe we need to find a way that we can actually have people making the decisions also have their interests focused and aligned with the people that are going to bear the consequences of those decisions, right?
Yeah, wouldn't that be something? And I'd say I would even push a tiny bit further, if I may be so bold, and say, and make sure that bridge is going somewhere we want to go. So I hear a lot of folks talking about pretty progressive, I think of as pretty progressive decision making and, flattening hierarchies and enabling greater innovation. And I love that. And I think it's along the lines of what you just described, like include the people who matter in the decisions. And I love the sounds of that. I think we're going to have a bit of a reckoning. I think we're in it. And I think the fact that you and I are talking and that more and more people are having pretty spicy conversations about this, I think is a good sign that we're in this reckoning. And I think the reckoning will involve getting honest with the fact that a lot of companies, what they currently do and generate value doing it, and where a lot of the returns come from, where a lot of the profit comes from, yes, where the jobs and innovation in is in activities or products or services that really don't belong in a life affirming economy. It's very awkward to say. And I've participated in a lot of this being
Mm-hmm.
true. But there is a degree, like it's a life cycle of our industrial
Mm-hmm.
awareness or industrial models, that some of the things that made really good sense 40, 50 years ago, or maybe even 5 years ago, don't make sense now. And they really don't make sense in the future. And the sooner we
Accept that.
just get honest about that and say, well, that's okay. Things come and they grow and they die, and we let them go. We compost them back
Right.
into whatever is to come
Right.
next, instead of fighting to, have it grow at all costs. And that comes back to the goal. Like, what is the goal? If it's grow financial wealth, which I think it still is for a huge percentage of folks in the financial services sector, it's
Mm-hmm.
almost a given. Yeah, that's our job. And I would argue, bluntly, let me throw a little funny thought bomb in here. I was doing a project, this goes back to 2012. It was for one of the largest agricultural equipment companies in the world. They make sprayers and all kinds of big ag machinery, and we were there doing their climate strategy, which just feels kind of ironic now. But anyways, my colleague on the project was this lovely Dutch woman who had amazing experience in humanitarian work, in innovative business models. She was a real kind of mentor to me. We're walking into the client project, and she just turns to me and she says, I've always wondered why there's even such thing as a for-profit bank. And it was such a powerful question. It's like, yeah, why is it just assumed that it's a part of a healthy economy to make money from money versus making money from healthy food or healthy people or kids that are happier or all the things that we know make life worth living? Because there's never been a song that, well, there's probably been a few now, but money can't buy you love. We know it. We've known it. We will always know it. It's just true. So the sooner we recognize yeah, make money, use money. Financial capital is important for the way we function today. Nothing wrong with that. And it's not the goal. The goal is to be well, to thrive. Make that the goal. And then let go of the stuff that's actually profiting from undermining that.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point, and I would say that the some of the more forward-thinking advisors that I've worked with would actually say exactly that. Like you're building your portfolio. The purpose of building a portfolio is not to have such and such a number as the end all a goal. It is, what do you intend to do with it? How is that money? What is it going to allow you to do? What is it for? It comes back to your point about what is purpose, right?
Mhm.
And I think again, it's probably a worthwhile conversation for everybody to have with themselves, with their advisors, what have you. It's a challenging conversation because it requires us to be introspective and think about our own intrinsic values and goals, and not take what is being given to us by. Not everybody wants to have a sports car. Although if you look at social media or whatever, that's what apparently we all want, right? Now, Lorraine, we're coming on time. So I've got one last question before going into the rapid fire questions. So you've been independent for nearly a decade, which gives you the freedom to ask uncomfortable questions and pursue work aligned with your values. Clearly, this comes with navigating some uncertainty and building a practice that matters. So, what have you learned, and what advice would you give to others thinking about something similar?
Yeah. I guess the number one thing I'd say is if you're wondering about it, you're probably not alone. Like, you're not crazy to notice that some things don't seem quite right. And so just voice it, just ask. Just keep asking if something doesn't seem like it quite makes sense.
I think that's a very powerful point. I think I'm recognizing that we have this almost cone of silence that we can't talk about these things. And this comes back to your earlier point that it's a very individualistic type of society. I would argue, and that's a whole different episode we can get into, we're becoming like that around the world, but it predominantly it's been a Western phenomena. This idea of individualism versus collectivism, and I don't mean that from an economic point of view. It is the fact that there is a greater sense of an understanding of what the impact of individual actions would have on those around you, and that there was obligations to some extent on those, which, by the way, existed in North America pre Ayn Rand and the cult of individualism. But again, as I said, that's a different story. But I think to your point, it is a very valid thing that asking questions, it's what they always used to say, right? If you're in a lecture or at school and you have a question and you think it's dumb, don't be afraid to ask it, because chances are that others are thinking the same thing. So it's a very valid reminder that you're giving. And look, my learning is that uncertainty is not it's not a bug, it's a feature of life, and our
Yeah.
job is to figure out how we move forward the best that we can without without making dumb moves, but at the same time without waiting for clarity that will never come.
Right? Yeah. Can I offer a quick build on that? When I was in the trenches in ESG, I was producing reports, I was facilitating dialogue, I was at the top of my game. I was well compensated. I was on podiums. I was invited to speak. It was a good ride career-wise. But more and more in the back of my mind, I was like, something doesn't seem to add up. And I was trying the question out, and I felt like I was being looked at like I had three heads. Why are you asking? Like, don't push back now. We're just getting traction. And I'm like, but we're getting traction on something that's kind of bullshitty, or like it's not helping. And so one day, it's a long story that what led to it, but I just kind of cracked and I wrote a blog. And I was already blogging a little bit, but very small following, didn't have a website, I just cracked. And I wrote a piece called something, I can't remember exactly, but something like why ESG data is like less wife beating, like trigger central, right? And I backed it up. Like, I was in it. I was like, here's my work. Here's what I'm seeing. And I couldn't sleep. I pushed go. I was like, oh, and I couldn't sleep. I was like, oh my God, I'm ruined. I'm going to get fired. I'm freelancing at this point. My clients are going to hate me. I'm going to get blocked by everybody. I woke up. My full-time job for the next week was responding to comments. There was one person who was triggered. She did not like the use of connecting to
Yeah, yeah.
abusive behavior. And I can back up my choice on that, by the way. That's also another episode. Every other person, including like senior clients that, or basically said to the word, I'm so glad you said this out loud. I thought I was going crazy. I published that years ago, and it was so validating. It was like, God, I've been like beetling away, getting paid to do this work, wondering what the heck, and saying it out loud, and saying it out loud to the core of, frankly, a burgeoning industry. I'm very glad I did it. So yeah, I just wanted to emphasize,
Oh, that's a great story. That was your Jerry Maguire moment, right?
I guess so. I just kind of lost it. I've had a few rounds of like, and each time people are like, "Oh my gosh, thank you for saying it." Now I'm just like, I'm just going to say what I think, and if it works for you, it works for you, and I'm not going to bottle it up. That's for sure.
Lorraine, so we're coming to the end of our podcast. So I have a couple of final rapid fire questions for you. So, number one, professionally, what is the most important lesson you've learned over the years?
Trust my gut.
And again, I think that's a very important lesson. And I think gut, and again, we can talk about this ad nauseum, but gut is experience. We don't want to give it credence. Nobody wants to say in our society that it's a gut, but the gut is hard earned experience that just can't vocalize what you're trying to say. So I totally agree with you.
Thank you.
Number two, what is one practical tip you would offer listeners keen on applying your insights?
Get really clear on what it is you're trying to change. And the way you'll know you're clear is if you can succinctly articulate from what to what. So, ranting is fine, being frustrated is fine, venting is fine, exploring ideas and throwing spaghetti at the wall, also fine. But if you want to make headway on something, could be anything, big, small, near, far, get really clear on what you seek to change from what to what. I have more thoughts on what you do next, but that is a necessity to even make that change. Otherwise, it's just churny churn and endless
I love
frustration.
that. I love that. That's very powerful. Lorraine, this has been a wonderful discussion. If listeners want to learn more about you or find your work, where do they go?
You can visit my website at blorrainesmith.com. And from there, I publish a weekly letter and I keep folks up to date about what's going on. So you're welcome to subscribe and get the latest news. I often share a lot of free work and also what's coming up where folks can get directly involved. So, yep, blorrainesmith.com, probably the best place to keep in touch, which I would love
Awesome.
to do.
They will be in the show notes for listeners. So, Lorraine, thank you for joining us today on The Uncertainty Edge.
Thanks so much, Sam. Great to be here. Talk soon. Bye
Talk
for now.
soon. In this episode of The Uncertainty Edge, I spoke with Lorraine Smith, a sustainability strategist and author who spent over 20 years working inside the corporate sustainability and ESG world, and ultimately walked away from it. Lorraine's journey from mainstream finance to ESG reporting to independent advisor gives her a rare insider's perspective on why so much well-intentioned sustainability work fails to create real change. Here are my three key takeaways. Number one, measuring impact without creating it is not enough. Lorraine's central provocation is that the ESG industry has become expert at measuring and disclosing activity without producing meaningful on the ground change. Having helped write thousands of pages of corporate sustainability reports herself, she offers a simple but powerful test for financial advisors and investors reviewing ESG disclosures. Ask not what was reported, but what actually changed. If an answer can't be found, or if the reports from different parts of the same company tell contradictory stories, that is itself important information. For advisors navigating client conversations about ESG, this reframes the task from evaluating disclosure quality to evaluating real world outcomes. Number two, purpose has to drive the business model, not sit beside it. One of Lorraine's sharpest insights is the gap between stated purpose and actual business model, and how that gap undermines any genuine sustainability effort. Drawing on her systems thinking framework, she reminds us that a system does what its goal actually is, not what it claims to be. When profit maximization remains the only goal, sustainability initiatives get marginalized to the edges of the business rather than embedded in its core. For financial advisors, this is a meaningful lens when evaluating companies. Does the sustainability narrative align with where the money actually comes from and where it goes? Number three, sustainable systems require proximity and honesty. Lorraine makes a compelling case that the leaders and organizations most likely to make responsible long term decisions are those closest to the consequences of their choices. Privately held, community embedded businesses, like the Austrian manufacturing firm I described, tend to take better care of their stakeholders because they can see them. For advisors helping clients think through sustainable investing or their own business succession, this principle applies directly. Proximity creates accountability. And the first step towards better decisions, Lorraine argues, is simply the courage to ask the uncomfortable question out loud. Because chances are others are thinking it too. Lorraine reminds us that uncertainty in sustainability isn't about just market volatility or regulatory change. It's about being willing to honestly examine whether the systems we're part of are actually serving life. For advisors committed to helping clients build portfolios and practices that last, that kind of clarity takes courage. Thanks for listening to The Uncertainty Edge. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Uncertainty Edge. If today's conversation sparked something, subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode. You'll get practical tools, deeper insights, and new episodes every other Tuesday. Please leave a review wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also subscribe to the newsletter at theuncertaintyedge.com.